Welcome to the Tamarind Intelligence Podcast, your trusted source for in-depth insights on market trends, regulatory developments, and data-driven analysis in the vape, nicotine, novel tobacco and cannabis sectors. Join us as we explore key topics shaping the future, offering expert perspectives to help you stay informed.
Well, hi, and welcome to the Tamarind Intelligence Podcast for the end of 2024. I'm Barnaby Page, Editorial Director at Tamarind Intelligence, and I have with me today three of our key people. There's Pablo Cano, Director of Regulatory Analysis. There's Eva Antal, who heads up our Market Analysis team, and there's Tim Phillips, our CEO. And we're going to have a pretty simple format for today's podcast, given that it's the end of the year, and we're all looking forward to another one. I'm going to go around the table, and I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to identify one of the most interesting things that they witnessed in the novel nicotine marketplace in 2024, and then one of the things they're most looking forward to, good or perhaps bad, in 2025. So Pablo, you head up the regulatory team looking at changes in the law, in public policy, in government and so on around the world. Could you give us your perspective on what's happened this year and what's happening next year?
Sure. Thank you, Barnaby. There are obviously several things happened. It's difficult to just single out one development, but I would say, for example, the European Union elections, despite for many in the industry, perhaps they didn't pay a lot of attention or was not, because tobacco was not a prominent topic in that election. But those elections are super important because from next year, we're going to see the development of the new Tobacco Products Directive. And the European Parliament is going to be asked to vote on what do we do with the tobacco control framework in Europe. For those that were in the industry 10 years ago, they will remember how in 2014, the European Parliament was key to stop the attempts by the European Union executive power, so the European Commission, to try to make cigarettes a medical-only product. Therefore, we expect the European Parliament to play a similar role in the sense of trying to diminish or moderate any attempt to enact very strict regulation, for example, a flavor ban or something like that. We think that the European Parliament is more likely to stop it than any other European institution. And the elections were key and fundamental because for the first time in many, many years, we had a significant change in the composition of Parliament. For the very first time, we have a parliament that is clearly leaning to the right, and we know that among those parties in the right, some of the new entries to the European Parliament, some of these new parties are even less likely to support strict regulation than the previous parliament used to be, right? So it's important because it's altering the stable majority that so far has ruled Europe, and it's even more important because it's going to be voting on the TPD3, which one could say is the most important piece of legislation that is going to be drafted next year.
So that's the same thing in a sense, being key to 24 was these elections leading up to what's going to happen with EU regulation in 25. Now, I understand that the details of the TPD3, of course, have not yet been disclosed. Do we have any relatively confident predictions of what might be in that piece of legislation?
Definitely, we have some predictions. At the same time, no one really knows what will happen. In our opinion, at Tamarind, we think that the most likely scenario is that the next TPD does not bring it will bring significant additional regulation. So it's going to increase the regulatory burden, but we do not expect it to become so stringent that it will put the industry at risk. For example, although it's been debated and many member states already adopted it, we don't think that the European Union will have a flavor ban in the next TPD, basically because we think the European Parliament is going to stop it, despite we think the European Commission will propose it, and many member states favor such a policy. Same applies to pouches. Many commentators are wondering whether or not pouches will eventually be banned in Europe. Well, we know that many member states already ban pouches, and we like to see a ban across Europe, but we do not expect such a ban. in general terms, what we expect is that regulation for combustible tobacco and novel tobacco, including nicotine-containing products, will become more similar. Not exactly the same, because otherwise flavors would be banned for all products, but we should expect that regulation will become tougher, more similar to combustible tobacco, and will give less opportunities for marketing, advertising. So things like plain packaging for traditional tobacco products certainly will be on the table, and so on. But overall, in general, we expect the European Union to maintain a relatively moderate framework for nicotine-containing products, not so much for combustibles, which will become hardly regulated, I think.
Yes, and of course, which will parallel what's going on in a lot of the world. Maybe this is a good time to turn to Tim Phillips, our CEO. Tim, I know we're looking primarily at 2024, 2025 today, but of course you were with Tamarind Intelligence. In fact, you just founded Tamarind Intelligence at the time of the last TPD, right back in 2014. I wonder if you could just give a couple of observations on what Pablo has been saying. How do you think the climate today, the regulatory climate, the policy climate, is similar, or for that matter, different from the atmosphere we had 10 years ago?
I mean, it's a good question, Barnaby. Yeah, and I think some observations I would have. Back then, of course, these products that we were looking at were completely new. So vape existed, nicotine pouch did not, and heated tobacco hardly. And so back then, the legislation that Europe was thinking about and the policy developments were really kind of new. And I think the difference with today is, of course, that there's a lot more understanding about the products. We have a number of different products available, so consumers are, at the moment trying all sorts of things that are alternatives to combustible cigarettes. I would say, though, I mean, the other thing, though, perhaps is how little it's moved on, and perhaps back then when, we were all thinking about TPD and policy around TPD2, I think we probably, if asked at the time, what do you think is going to happen in 10 years? I think we might have thought that things would have moved on a little bit more than they have. So, yeah, so I think my answer is a bit, mixed. I mean, I think in some ways, everything has changed. We've got a lot more understanding, we've got more products, there's a lot more choice out there. We've been through various different kind of scenarios of regulatory developments. At the same time, I think the issues are exactly the same. The kinds of things that are being talked about in the media and are being talked about at the European Parliament are pretty much the same as they were 10 years ago, which is a bit depressing in some ways.
Well, absolutely, yes. So a lot of change on the surface, but perhaps not so much change in the underlying issues. With that in mind then, Tim, and looking back now at 2024 and 25, what do you think were the salient things to stand out from the last year and to look forward to next year? Not necessarily in Europe, could be anywhere.
So I think a big development was in the way that heated tobacco has grown, I think, has been a surprise. And the way it's grown in markets outside of the Asian markets, Japan and Korea, where it's really strong, has been surprising over the last, not just over the last year, but over the last 5+ years. I think some of the developments that are kind of key to that will be to see that, those products are very much seen as tobacco products, whereas I think vape and pouch are seen rather separately. I think heated tobacco, the launch of IQOS in the US was a big development, happened very recently. We were talking about it earlier, weren't we? The development of flavored herbal sticks by the major tobacco companies as well has really rolled out. So we've got we've got a really much more sophisticated heated tobacco market. So I think that was one of the key things for me. Maybe I'm going to take your one now, but I think the other great thing that we saw happen this year in vape was this kind of emergent big puff disposable category with big screens and games and all the things that really worry regulators. So I think those two things, and again, that's all wrapped up in, Barnaby, what you and I talked about quite recently about the illicit market. We have a significant problem with illicit products in vape. It's causing not just a problem for regulators, but I think it's causing a big problem for the sort of, it's an existential problem for the category, if you like. I think consumers and the general public are really worried about the fact that this market appears to be out of control. And I think that was one of the big developments this year.
Absolutely. I think, on the vape front, for the past couple of years, I think we would have had to identify disposables as a major development. First, in the sense of their sheer market growth, and then, of course, in the regulatory backlash against them. Pablo has already mentioned flavour bans, and flavour bans, of course, in many cases are in effect disposable bans. That's one of the effects they have, is to abolish that entire category. So thinking about that kind of background to it, Eva, the growth of disposables, then the regulatory moves against disposables, where does that leave the kind of next generation of products, as it were, that Tim was just referring to? Do you think those were going to be the big story of 2025?
Yes, Barnaby. It seems that the past year was a really like the unfolding of a huge battleground of all these alternative nicotine products for nicotine consumers and smokers. And disposables had this huge growth because of certain aspects, right? Which is, the flavors obviously are appealing to consumers. Their price have reduced to such an extent that it's very easy to make that purchasing decision to buy one, to try one, and they are easy to carry around, and they are now, technology-wise, the amount of innovation going into these products since 2020, when in the US, the Food and Drug Administration had the guidance on pre-filled pods, and the removal of those flavors left a vacuum in products to fill. And this wave of innovation going into this miniaturization of batteries and product development focused on disposables, and now they are, sometimes 20-25 milliliter large products with which you can also play games. So this journey to happen within these 3 years, and 2024 was this kind of time when technologies have started to kind of be integrated into these products and turn into some kind of entertainment centers, but at the same time allowing a lot of customization, which is not just something that happens in vape, but it happens in all technology related products. So it's not a surprise that it happens with vape as well, but it further increases the appeal, the functionality that consumers are getting out of this. Well, but this is just one side of the story, because this is markets where product characteristics are not that limited, right? So this is the non-TPD markets where tank capacity can increase ever, and the nicotine strength is also not capped. Now, in TPD markets, where Pablo was talking about further regulation coming, and probably trying to cover a lot of aspects of the products, which now we see developments about. Closing loopholes, exactly. Is a bit harder to compete on, to show that, oh, my product is way better than the other person's product, because it can only have 2 milliliters and only 20 milligram per milliliter nicotine. So manufacturers are trying different ways to distinguish themselves in the market, which can happen via the coil atomization technology improvements, but also finding the loopholes, which are around the 2 milliliter capacity of these products. So we are now seeing more of these 10+2 products where brands can claim that their product is 12, 24 milliliter capacity, and we are seeing them in TPD markets, and they are legitimate products as far as they are on the market and not being removed at the moment. So yes, there is a lot happening. This is vape, right? And what we have also seen in 2024 was around another type of nicotine consumption, which is with nicotine pouches, which is the oral way, which picked up very significantly and seemed to kind of touch some buttons of consumers, which are around the discreetness and being able to consume nicotine in situations where vaping and emitting smoke and vapor is not allowed. So that's something to also watch in 2025.
Well, and also I was going to add to that, maybe because our thinking, I think, is that more and more we're going to see crossovers between these different groups. So consumers who were traditionally in the vape space, a lot of them are moving into pouch at the same time. And so trying to figure out how much there is that crossover and to what extent does that change the developments of the market, I think would be really interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, I think, that can work both ways. We've already seen some signs, some very early signs this year of a little bit of a kind of anti-pouch backlash in terms of the public conversations and panic about youth usage of pouches and so on. If pouch really takes off in the way that vape did back in the mid-late 2010s, are we going to see the same thing happening there? I don't know, but certainly something to watch out for next year. Before we go, though, I will go around the table with one last question, one I must admit I hadn't prepared you for, but I'm sure you all have answers. And this does relate to the country, in fact, where we've seen that pouch backlash, to the United States. Of course, one of the world's biggest markets for anything, and certainly the world's largest market for vape. The one word that is likely to excite even stronger opinions than disposable is, of course, Trump. So perhaps starting with Eva first. Quick answer. The new president taking office in January, good news or bad news for the novel nicotine sector?
I think I like to be optimistic. And I think for such an industry where, players and manufacturers and they're so quick to react, quick to adapt. I think change needs to be perceived as an opportunity, and I think it's a big change, and I think the industry will grab the bull by the horns and run with it. That's my hope.
Great, Tim. Would you go with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think I mean, and again, it's not just what do we think. I mean, I think the market is reacting quite positively to it. I think we're seeing quite a lot of the manufacturers and brands react positively to it. I think there's a great hope that Trump will do what he says, and I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around that. And will he indeed say vape? But I suspect that we're likely to see some changes, particularly in the way that the FDA starts to go through the PMTA process. I can't help but feel that has got to speed up under a new administration. So I think positive ultimately, yeah.
Yeah, and Pablo, as Tim says, a lot of unknowns, particularly in the regulatory area. How does it look from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the industry should be seen, or I think it should be seen as a positive change, basically because during the previous administration term, things were not going in the right direction in many aspects. For example, products with a flavor were not being approved. The messages were very, very negative. So any change into that approach is likely to be positive. And as Tim said, the industry is already anticipating that some things will change. However, I think it needs also to be put into, the debate, the fact that the US, it's not isolated, right? And, part of the Trump policies are related to putting tariffs on China. That could have an impact beyond, actual policy in the US, right? If I don't know, 20% tariff, we all know that the majority of products are manufactured in China. How is it going to affect the consumer, prices? All of that is yet to be seen. So positive in some aspects, quite uncertain in a few others.
Absolutely. So some things to be wary of there, but overall 3 out of 3 of our panelists taking an optimistic view. So that's a positive note to end our podcast with. Thank you, Eva, Tim, Pablo.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Tamarind Intelligence Podcast. Stay tuned for more insights and expert analysis. Get actionable data at your fingertips.